This is Software-Defined Survival, where we explore how software-defined systems are changing the business of AV IT. Today on Software-Defined Survival.
And so we look further down the line. So we look at Zoom, we look at things like Barco's Overture, we look at Utelligy, we look at all of these things that are pure software control systems, or we start to get into full video transmission. What happens when you don't own the full extent of the pipeline? How many clients do you have around the world where you use a VPN to get into them? Any of them in the US, that VPN access could be restricted simply because of how the rules were written. Every single device that could connect to a network, even if it doesn't, but if it could connect to a network, has to be shipped with a unique password or the ability to or the requirement to change that password. So literally every IoT device on the planet, anything that's going to get sold into California. And so the question becomes whether or not, how this is going to affect AV when we have thousands of devices that connect to a network in a building.
Welcome to Software Defined Survival. My name is Patrick Murray, and today's guest has taken an interesting detour from his AV career path. And I'm really looking forward to speaking with him today about some of the legal issues that come up in AV integration. So please welcome to the podcast, Josh Srago. Josh, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Patrick. I really appreciate it.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background in AV, how you got started, and what you're up to now?
Sure. The long and the short of it is, like many people, I was a musician and I needed to find a way to make money. And so I ended up working in live sound for many, many years. Eventually, I moved on to running a corporate facility for an energy utility in California. And then I transitioned from there to working for a manufacturer, doing product support. And then eventually I was running their training and consultant liaison program. After about 4.5 years of that, I moved on to be working at an integrator where I served as a project manager and then eventually as the head of engineering. And then after a few more years of that, I went to work for TCOM, a global consulting firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then after a few years of that, while all of this was going on, I started writing for my blog, soundreason.org, for AV Nation, for Commercial Integrator Magazine, for Sound and Communications, for a bunch of people. And one of the topics that was really, really appealing to me was net neutrality initially. It was just this idea of when we were talking about what net neutrality was in the US, and we were talking about how this would affect transportation of video signals when you talk about fast lanes and being able to reserve portions of a network, how are business communications going to be affected against, say, the stream of Netflix? So for those that work later at the office, how would your video conferences be affected when you have less bandwidth available to you effectively, was the question I started asking. And I dug more and more into it. And I just became absolutely fascinated by the way that tech policy was being written and how ignorant the people writing it seemed to be of how technology actually worked and how the networks were utilized and how policies were so restrictive or limited in their scope. And eventually I sat down with a woman at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University named Irina Raciu. And she and I talked for a while, and I basically said, hey, I'm just looking for partners to help me, spread the message of what we're going through and figure out how to do this. And she just said, well, why don't you do it? And that was how I ended up applying to law school. And I ended up getting into law school at Santa Clara University. And I am days away from finishing my first year. So anything you hear in this podcast does not constitute legal advice, just more analysis and interpretation of what I'm seeing things to be.
Is that the first thing they teach you, is to say that?
Well, being a law student, I am not allowed to represent anybody. That would get me in a lot of trouble. So yes, the first thing is this does not constitute legal advice.
Cool. I like, the arc. The thing about AV is, as long as you work hard and you got a head on your shoulders and you know how things work, really every option is open. So I think that's pretty interesting going from a sound guy to a project manager and consultant. I like to hear about those kind of success stories. I think it's really interesting that switch, taking net neutrality and becoming a lawyer because of that, or studying law because of that. And you got to the point, right? Like there will be video signals over the internet. Like we're using Zoom right now, and that takes up bandwidth. And how that bandwidth is handled is going to become more and more important to people in the AV industry. What are your thoughts on that dynamic, and how it's kind of playing out? Like we would call this a soft codec, and it's not really something we've ever really needed to be concerned about before.
So taking the 2015 Open Internet bill, the Open Internet order that the previous administration passed, one of the issues with it is it wrote in a lot of exceptions. So what it protects technically is any traffic accessible from virtually any browser cannot be blocked, throttled, or forced to pay for paid prioritization. So basically anything you can access from a web browser or from a PC.
Being received by a web browser.
Being received, being transmitted, anything you're looking at in terms of web browsing traffic. Like that's what the order protects. And then when you dive into it further, there's a bunch of exceptions as to what it doesn't protect, like health monitors. It doesn't protect other devices or other systems. One of the things that it specifically excludes is VPNs. And I started to look at all of these things, and I started to say, I actually ended up asking the FCC questions to the point where they threw an attorney at me. And one of the questions I asked was, you realize that you've set unfair business practices because web traffic codecs, soft codecs like we're using now, are web browser based. You can log onto a web browser and use that browser in order to perform these communications. That's not how a hard codec works. It's not virtually accessible from any browser, which means that they have set an unfair business practice between the two types. And they had to agree. They couldn't, I couldn't quote anybody that I was right, but they basically had to admit that yes, because of the fact that a hard codec is not virtually accessible from any browser, they've set an unfair business practice. And this is where you start to get into the questions and the importance of it, of how are we using the technology today and what is the policy being written? And so we look further down the line. So we look at Zoom, we look at things like Barco's Overture, we look at Uteligy, we look at all of these things that are pure software control systems, or we start to get into full video transmission. What happens when you don't own the full extent of the pipeline? How do you get video from point A to point B when you have to go over somebody else's pipe effectively? So if I'm trying to make a conference call between two campuses in San Francisco and Seattle, okay, well, I don't own the entire fiber link between those. How does that data get treated? And is it fair, or is it right for businesses looking to make their corporate communications to suffer just because that they don't have those opportunities? Or when you talk about remotely servicing clients, I mean, you're in Germany. How many clients do you have around the world where you use a VPN to get into them? Any of them in the US, that VPN access could be restricted simply because how the rules were written. And while the bill is dead on arrival in the Senate right now, and the president has said he's going to veto it, there was a bill that just passed through the House saying we're going to restore the 2015 Open Internet orders. And I was one of the few people at my school specifically where everybody's saying, sign the petition, we want to make this go through. And I went, no, you don't, because you don't actually know what it says, because you haven't read it, and the dangers that it presents in terms of people being able to communicate. It protects web browser traffic, but that's it. And if that's what it's limited to, then that's not a bill that really does any good for all of the other various uses. Think about autonomous vehicles.